Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 12th Z Jaipur Literature Festival. We are here at Darbar Hall, and we've got global shifts. Are the Nordics different? Please welcome our panelist, Henriette Rostrup, Martin Gelin, in conversation with Karin Pettersson. This session is presented by Nordic Lights. Can we please give them a big round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and very welcome to this session. My name is Karin Pettersson. I will be moderating this conversation. I will also take part in the conversation myself. My background is in journalism and in politics, and I was, until fairly recently, the political editor-in-chief of Scandinavia's largest newspaper, Aftonbladet. And with me today, I have Martin Gelin, a New York correspondent for another really big Scandinavian Swedish newspaper, daily newspaper, an author, and anything more you want to say about yourself?
The second biggest newspaper in Sweden.
Yeah, the second biggest newspaper. And Henriette Rostrup, who is a Danish author, and her latest book was nominated for the European Union, a major European literary prize.
Yes.
So we're here today to discuss how the challenges that are affecting the globe, globalization, value shifts, technological changes are also challenging a very specific way of life, namely the Scandinavian welfare societies, the Nordic countries. And just to kind of frame this discussion, I would like to just describe this model, the Scandinavian model that we talk a lot about in the Nordics, in Scandinavia. And maybe you could describe it as a societal structure that is based on a combination of openness and free markets and openness towards the rest of the world, export-oriented, as I said, very free market on the business side, but on the other hand also large welfare states, high taxes, and these very kind of coherent and trust-based societies, and all of them kind of built on a social democratic political tradition. And my first question to the panel would be, with the challenges we all now are facing, as I said, with globalization, migration flows, technological disruption, does this model even, does it work, and will it work, and what are if there are threats, what are they? Who wants to start? Henriette.
I think, in my opinion, it's the most beautiful model. But I think it takes work for it to work. You cannot be complacent and think that that welfare is just something that you get. Whenever you go to the US, I've lived in New York like Martin, and whenever you go to the US, they would always say, but you're a communist country. But we're not. But that's based on the fact that we pay sort of high taxes, and we get free universities, free hospitals, all this. But now what is happening is that there's a generation of politicians who thinks that this welfare thing that we get, that we just get it. And we don't have to pay taxes in order to get it. And so suddenly parts of this highly functional system is actually falling apart, because people who have grown up with getting everything, free education, free school, free hospitals, free everything basically, they think that they made it because they're really clever, and not because they were part of a system that works. So they're starting to dismantle it in a certain sense with political, liberal, more right-wing solutions. And then what happens is it doesn't work as well. So the welfare system and the Scandinavian model is something that you constantly have to work at for it to work.
So that's one threat, and that's kind of a generational threat, Henriette. Almost as you described it, almost as a like the spoiled next generation who doesn't want to.
Yeah. I think a lot of the welfare things in Denmark is post World War II. A lot of things about how many weeks can you work a week, or how many hours can you work a week. How long should the children go to school, education, all this. This are things that came after World War II. And it came because people in the pre-war area, in the war area and post-war area, they knew exactly why it was needed. Same thing with human rights. It was obvious why we needed a human rights convention. But now the generations, they think it's just something that's there. They don't know why it's there because they're complacent. They look at Denmark and they think, but everything works here, and why should we pay more in tax? Because it works. Why I want a bigger car, and why should I not have a bigger car when these people are just cashing in on Social Security or something like that? So they forget that in order to make a society work, you have to take care of the weakest in your society, and that way you lift off everybody. So yeah, I think it's partly a generational spoiled problem.
Thank you. Martin, do you have any other perspectives in that, in terms of threats or in terms of challenges?
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of threats, but I think my perspective is I've lived in the US for almost 2 decades, and which has been interesting to follow the conversation on the Nordic countries. As you said, in New York, they assume that the Nordic countries are socialist, and there's often need to explain the actual dynamic that Karin introduced with. But for a long time, I think as a Swede in exile, I think I was sort of part of these people that you were talking about who took everything for granted in Sweden. And whenever there were small shifts happening, when I was sitting in New York reading about the elections in Sweden, and I think I didn't think that they were actually challenging the fundamentals of the model, that they were just tweaking it. And but I think there are now fundamental threats to that model, and there are an increasing amount of people who want to fundamentally shift the Nordic model.
And where does that threat? Where does that come from, and why? What's the reason for that? Is it about ideology? Is it about the new generation wanting to abandon the nanny state, or what's the? Or is it, as Henriette says, something people take for granted and they don't really see that it's a slippery slope leading to something completely different? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I feel like there are a lot of different ways to answer that. But I mean, just to take one example, I think when I grew up, schools were, everyone went to public school. It was a very efficient vehicle for social mobility. My school I grew up in a suburb outside of Stockholm. It had 3 very distinct neighborhoods, like the wealthy neighborhood, the middle class neighborhood, and the low income neighborhood. And we all went to the same school. And that's not the case anymore. Now the rich kids go to one school and the poor kids go to one school. And I think I think that has done a lot of damage to the sort of sense of solidarity and cohesion in the country. And I think it's also just looking at the metrics, it seems like social mobility is not as strong as it used to be. That's just one anecdotal example.
So I think there's an interesting kind of dichotomy, or it's almost like a binary. If you go view of the this model, the Scandinavian model, if you go for some political movements, I think for progressives, for example, in the US, there's this idea of Scandinavia that is still very strong. If you talk to a person like Bernie Sanders or other progressives, they still think about the Scandinavian model as something that really that they're aiming for in terms of, you know, Social Security for all, Medicare for all. These are ideas that come from this model, or that's been realized in this model. On the other hand, there's another idea of Scandinavia now that's becoming more and more prominent, and it's really this, and I think it's specifically Sweden, or to a high degree Sweden, that is being painted as this dystopia, immigration dystopia, or the fact that Sweden has accepted a large number of refugees in the last few years has been used in propaganda from the far right, and it's been used by Donald Trump. It's been used by not a lot of election campaigns all around Europe, from Hungary to Czech Republic to Poland. You would use the idea of Sweden as this immigrant country as kind of a dystopian society, more and more polarized, more and more crime. It's not fact-based always, or it's not fact-based at all, actually, but there are now, I think, for the first time maybe, like two really competing ideas of what this model is. Is it this utopian progressive paradise, or is it this dystopian, crime-ridden, naive crime scene? Do you agree with those two polarized ideas of Scandinavia, that they exist? And
I think in the case of Denmark, I think they exist mostly in a sort of, as you say, not fact-based, right-wing media outlets, and then unfortunately in our Minister for Integration, who, you know, there will be rhetoric saying the Syrians are at the borders. And let's face it, the Syrians come all the way from Syria, they go through Turkey, they sail across the Mediterranean if they don't drown, then they have to move all the way up through Greece, and maybe in through the eastern part of Europe, or maybe the other way up. And then when they get to Denmark, this is a journey that might take a year, two. Not that many makes it up to Denmark. There is no Syrians at the gate. So it's a rhetoric that is dismantling the social conscience in Denmark. And back to the picking apart like the model, the welfare model, then the rhetoric kind of goes around, because it says the picking apart, there's not that many resources for hospitals right now, for example, because there have been constant cuts in the resources to the hospital system with these past 10, 15 years. So the hospitals don't work as well. But instead of saying, but that's because we cut money to this part of the system, they now say, it's because of all the refugees. They're taking something away from us. But they're not. And every study shows that the more integrated immigrants and migrants you have in a society, the better the society works. Studies have shown with Brexit that in areas where there's a lot of people coming from different parts of the world, whether they're refugees or immigrants or migrants or whatever, social welfare goes up. Because the interesting thing is that these people, they pay their taxes, but they don't really use the welfare services. They don't go to hospital as much. They don't use the doctor as much. They don't go on pension until they're really old. They come, so they actually add a lot to society without taking a lot out. They add. But that's a fact no one really cares about, because there are really brilliant scare picture that you can put out there. Look at this evil brown man coming with his evil culture, taking something away from us with the white privilege. You can hear I'm not really happy about it.
We all recognize that. So Martin, you've been living in the US for the last 20 years. How has the perception of Scandinavia changed over time? And would you agree with my initial kind of brutal...
No, absolutely. I've covered a few presidential elections in America and traveled to 49 states of the country. In the last few years, there's been much more awareness of Sweden, which has, I think, come from both the left and the right. Like in the last presidential election, it was particularly obvious with the sort of examples that you were hinting at Bernie Sanders' events with the progressive left. Everyone was very enthusiastic to hear that I was from Sweden because they think that Sweden is paradise and that it is this sort of socialist utopia. And on the Donald Trump rallies, they were very concerned to hear that I was from Sweden, and they're like, "Oh, I understand that you like got out of there as soon as you can. I've read about what happened there." And Donald Trump in 2017 made a speech where he was talking about an alleged attack that had happened in Sweden, which hadn't taken place. He made it up, and that that was born out of this very long-running narrative on far-right websites and in the far-right ecosystem in the U.S. of Sweden as a kind of paradise that was destroyed by migrants, which is also kind of funny because they didn't really believe it was a paradise in the first place, but they still believe in that it was somehow ruined by immigration. There's a very clear contrast in this understanding, Barack Obama, he visited, I think he was the only sort of recent president who has visited Sweden, right? He visited Sweden a few years ago, and he had a more nuanced understanding of Sweden. I remember he praised Sweden for having, a combination of dynamic free market economy with a very healthy business environment, great, technology startups and innovation. And also a strong safety net, a social safety net that gives people, general sense of security. But that is extremely rare to meet people in America, or I think anywhere in the world, that understands that those two things can coexist.
So one of the main policy debates in Europe and in the US, and I guess all over right now, is how to explain the rise of the extreme right, or the rise of right-wing populism. And to put it very, bluntly, there's this one team saying that it's all about economics, it's all about inequality, it's about the fundamentals, basically. And then you have this other group who would say, no, it's about identity, and it's about migration, and it's about these cultural challenges that comes with another part of globalization. And I think, at the core of this discussion, and at the core of the question we're discussing right now is, because in all the Nordic countries, in all the Scandinavian countries, you have, at this point, big parties, big right-wing populist parties, and they're to a more or lesser degree extreme. And actually, the Swedish version is worse in the sense that it's really, it really has its historical roots in the neo-Nazi movement. So they are pretty hardcore. And then you have the Norwegian version, which is maybe not as evil on a scale. But from Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, we all have these parties, and they are all big. So I think one question that comes out of this is, how could your countries with social cohesion, very equal, high social mobility, why do these parties work so well, even in Scandinavia? And Henriette, in Denmark, you really are forerunners
which
in
is
this sense, because you've had one of these parties in Denmark for a long time, very much dominating the public discourse.
Yes.
In a sense. Could you? What's your? I mean, this is not a. This is a big question, but could you just give your?
We have something called the Danish People's Party. Already, the name of the party gives a bad ring to it, and they. I think one of the reasons that they've gained so much power is that they are actually really good at what they do. They are very good at their rhetorics, and they're very good at manipulation. They're very good at using the press and the media. And I think for the first 15 years of when they were in existence and they were growing as a party, they used this to a much better extent than the Social Democratic, the Social Democratic Party has always been the largest party in Denmark, still is, despite the fact that it's not in government. But the left wing and also parts of the more moderate right wing, they couldn't keep up. They didn't know. They just didn't know what the Danish People's Party was doing, because they were using the press in an unprecedented way, and it would be from the head of the party, who also made the party, Pia Kjærsgaard. She would do things like, she was very unpopular with certain groups in Denmark, obviously, and a lot of these groups were obviously immigrant groups, but they would be like second or third generation, where their parents had maybe come from Pakistan or Morocco or something like that, and they had come and they had worked and they had settled in, and then their kids, second or third generation, would discover that in some ways, even though they had gotten all these things from the welfare system, in some ways they didn't feel quite welcome anyway, because of this Danish People's Party's rhetoric about them. So she would set up these things where she would deliberately make a conflict, and then she would make sure that the press was there. Like I live in a neighborhood in Copenhagen called Nørrebro. It's the most diverse neighborhood of Copenhagen, or probably of all of Denmark. There are all these different people from everywhere, and there are students and artists and families, and everybody is from everywhere. It's class diverse, and it's religious and everything. And it's a neighborhood that works. Of course, there's also problems, as there would be in any place. And so she would set up, for example, that she would go, she would release news in the press that now she was going to Nørrebro, and that she needed police protection because the brown people, the immigrants from Nørrebro, did not like her. And then there would be like one silly teenage boy, maybe throwing some paint at her. And then the next day, there would be this, or it was an apple, actually. Sorry, it was an apple. He threw an apple at her. And then the next day, there was a picture on the front cover of all the newspapers of Pia Kjærsgaard doing like this behind police officers. So there was made a story about how all immigrants hated her and how she needed police protection, but it was a situation that she had set up herself. So they were really, really good, and I think that's one of the reasons that they gained so much power, and suddenly they had all this power, and there was a whole group of other parties that were like, what just happened? They had no clue, they didn't see it coming. So that's one way I think they got power.
Yeah. Martin, you've been studying right-wing extremism in the US, but also from a distance been studying what's been going on in Scandinavia.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of universal, or at least there's a lot of commonalities between the US and Scandinavian right-wing populism. In many ways, Donald Trump was kind of imported European right-wing populism to the States. And I think, I mean, apart from what you've mentioned already, I think part of it is especially in America, but in some parts, in some ways in Nordic countries as well, a bit of a crisis for legitimacy for this sort of neoliberal right wing. After the financial crisis of 2008, they needed a new narrative, they needed a new story to tell that wasn't just about, you know, lower taxes, cut regulations, start more businesses. People didn't really resonate anymore with the sort of the people who weren't the winners of the modern economy, and with the massive also inequality coming out of the modern economy. So I think a sort of nativist message became in part a solution to that problem. It has become a message that works very well for right-wing parties, and we've seen a sort of graying in between the sort of established conservative parties and the far-right populist parties, which certainly happened in the US, but it's also happened in Sweden, where you know, the last election has been, you know, for the past few months contested over how coalitions are going to be formed, with the traditional conservative party trying to basically form a coalition with the far-right party. You know, I think it's in a lot of part it's a crisis for the right, which is not really talked about in that sense.
So if I can just add a couple of points to that discussion, I would also add the fact that, I mean, in Europe and in Scandinavia specifically, it used to be the social democratic parties that kind of, if there was discontent within, in broader groups in society, the social democratic parties were like mass movement parties, big tent parties that really, with really close connections to the labor movement. So if there was discontent in broad groups in society, there was a channel between those groups and the party in power, which was usually Social Democrats for a few decades after World War II. But since the 90s, I guess the late 80s, the social democratic parties in Europe and Scandinavia as well have become more technocratic, and they have really lost touch with many of their earlier voter groups. And I mean, the early success for the right-wing populists were really that they were able to attract these discontented voters that used to vote for social democrats. So it's also, I mean, it's a sign of crisis for the right, but it's also a crisis for social democracy, kind of the mirror image of that crisis, I would argue.
I mean, I think from my perspective, sitting across the Atlantic in the US, I think in some ways it's also, I mean, like social democrats in Europe are always in despair over the past decade, but in some ways their crisis is a crisis of success. They have succeeded in creating a middle class that is huge, and a lot of people who now maybe don't identify with the people that call themselves a labor party. So you know, it's in some sense they don't feel like they need social democracy anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other aspect I would add is mainly historical, because there used to, I mean, there was this period after the Second World War where certain types of rhetoric just did not work in the public discourse. Very aggressive nationalism, for example, or blatant racism. You just could not use that in the public sphere because we were too close, basically, to the Holocaust in Europe. So I think it's also, I don't know if you agree with me, but I think it's also a question of time that the people who were around during World War II, they're just not around anymore. So now it's possible again to use that kind of rhetoric without being punished in the public arena. Do you agree with that?
Definitely, and I think it has allowed the rhetoric to move from. in Denmark there's a really horrible but useful term called the Jew test. And it means that if you say something really bad about something, if you say something really horrible about Muslims or Hindu people or something like that, could you exchange the word Hindu with Jew, and would it then be okay? Because everybody knows, because of World War II, that you cannot talk about Jews this way. And so it's a horrible term, but it's a term to define how you can talk about other people. But the thing that's happened in the past years in Denmark is that if you do that, someone will counter that with saying, oh, you're just being touchy, or that's not what I mean, or I'm not a racist, and actually what will also be said is like, oh, are you going to be a Swede now? Because it's true, because in Sweden there's been so much about how do we use language, and how do we speak about women?
The politically correct.
The politically correct Sweden. And see, I'm one of those people who actually don't mind political correctness. I think it's a sign of wanting to treat other people right, and
we'll make you an honorary Swede.
I like Sweden. It has its limits, of course, too, and it can be too tight. But that's one of the things that, well, then you know how you dismantle a discussion by there's these, I think it's 7 points of like, you laugh at it, you make it invisible, you degrade it, you do, and that's one of the ways of degrading and making a problem invisible, is if you say, you're just like a Swede, because you want to point to a fact that this is not an okay way to speak about other people. So you made the problem go away, you're just a silly girl.
So from what I take away from this discussion then, because I mean the question we started out with is, are the Nordics is the Nordic different? Are the Nordic countries different? And from what you're saying is that yes, maybe we were, but now we're moving towards not being so different anymore. And I just want to challenge that because I mean, I'm middle-aged by now, and I think for the last, as long as I've been active in public, in reading the news, basically, I mean, there's always been this idea of, it used to be we were different, but now we're becoming like everyone else. And at the same time, we still have very high taxes, we still have very robust welfare system, we still have, you know, high growth and open markets. So is it not just, isn't it in a way a more robust system than what you're describing right now?
I think it's a robust system, and I mean, you have to recognize it still works. It works so much better than a lot of other systems, but in all my years of reading the news, it has gone down. You know, it has gotten worse and worse and worse, and I'm nervous about, like, there's an election coming up in Denmark within the next year, and the Danish People Party actually looks as if it's going to be part of the government. This is a horrible, horrible thought to me. And they will dismantle things. They will do it more, what do you call it, more specifically. They won't cover it up, and it won't be in small parts. So, but obviously, it still works. It still works a lot better than, but we don't pay that much taxes. I pay 36% in tax. It's this myth about Denmark being, oh, you pay more than half your earnings in tax. When I lived in New York City, I paid more taxes in New York than I did in Denmark, because you pay state taxes, you pay federal taxes, and you pay city taxes. And then you pay taxes on all the things you buy. So, but the American myth about low taxes, in contrast to the Nordic countries, it's a myth.
And you also pay a 15% tip on everything, because
Yeah.
you have to subsidize the wages of everybody in the service industry. but yeah, I mean, I think sort of going back to the original question that there is also a real challenge that all Nordic countries have to deal with, and maybe particularly Sweden. I mean, Sweden has moved within one generation. Since I was born till today, we have moved from being one of the most ethnically homogeneous countries in the world, almost as homogeneous as Japan, to being as diverse as America. Yeah. Sweden is almost as diverse today as America, which I don't think most people know. And that's in a climate where nativist sentiments are on the rise. That's a pretty fertile ground for nativism. And I think, if you look at political science, there has been a lot of research showing that support for the welfare state is often challenged by diversity. People are more likely to support higher taxes, redistributive policies, if they think that their neighbor looks like them and shares their values. The challenge, I think, for Sweden and for the countries that wants to preserve a kind of social safety net and welfare state is to sort of redefine national identity as something bigger than ethnicity, right? The way America has always done, right? But America has always had a much weaker safety net. But they have successfully had a more inclusive definition of who is an American. You can come to America and get a green card or a citizenship and call yourself an American, no matter where you are from in the world. And few people will challenge that. Donald Trump will probably challenge it, but before him, most Republicans would have agreed with the idea. Ronald Reagan agreed with the idea that immigration was what made America great. He literally said so. And Sweden, I think, hasn't really sort of culturally even started dealing with the fact that they are a different country today than they were 30 or 40 years ago.
So talking about culture and identity, and I will, after this round of questions, I will ask you in the audience if you have questions for us. But talking about culture and identity, and I mean the rise of the radical right and the kind of the weakening of social democracy and this old, and I agree with that. I just mainly wanted to challenge you, but I do think that there has been a major shift in the last 15 years. As writers and authors, how has that affected art? I know in Denmark you've had this big discussion around public broadcasting, for example, and in Sweden we also have a big discussion around culture as a way, like how should culture, how should it be used, and can it be used to kind of form a national identity in this identity project that you talk about? Martin, can you say something about the
how culture fits into this?
How culture
this conflict
fits into this conflict, and
absolutely.
how artists react, and how we should think about this.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if you compare to the darkest recent era of far right ideology, the 1930s in Europe, I think most of the countries where the far right was strong was also very much, they knew that they had to first win the culture and then win the elections, right? Today, they maybe know that, but it's hard to find sort of concrete examples of art that is supportive of supporting the values of the nativists, of the far right populists. As far as there is a sort of a culture of the far right, I think it's sort of inherently a reaction against progressive and liberal culture, right? It's what you were talking about before, like you dismiss someone as Swedish or as politically correct, or you talk about a new movie or a new novel or an interview with an author or a poet coming out as yeah, this is just politically correct nonsense. But they haven't been able, with all the rise in political support of the far right, they haven't really been able to create any art that is an alternative to the dominant culture, which is still liberal, which is still progressive.
Henriette?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Luckily, I think that I think they're trying. There's a politician right now. He would like to be the cultural minister or the minister of culture. And in Denmark, I don't know how it is otherwise, but in Denmark, the Ministry of Culture has always been this like kind of stepmotherly position. It's the one where you put a little bit older politicians, they've kind of had their turn at other things, and then you put them over there. And they are the Ministry of Culture, and mainly for many, many years it's been, because the Danish system has there was a very famous Danish Minister of Culture, Julius Bomholt. He created the Danish Art Council, and he created it with something called the arm's length principle, so that politics should be separate from art. And one of the reasons he created the Arts Council is in Denmark, there live less people than there do in Jaipur, just so you understand the size. We are less than 6 million people. So you can't really have art on just based on the market, because the market is simply not big enough. So we have subsidies. But it's dangerous to have a stately arts council, because there could be censorship. So he created this arts council with the arm's length principle. Politicians were not allowed to decide what the money should be given to. And that arm's length principle has been, with different rules, cut more and more. So it's not like it's censorship, but maybe artists will self-censor in order to get the funding, and so it's a slippery slope in that sense. I don't know if you know the great Danish film director, Lars von Trier. He's the Dogma director. And we've just had the Minister of Culture. She's not from the National People's Party, but she's right-wing. And he's just made a film called The House That Jack Built, about a serial killer. It's really not a nice, pleasant film. But she comes out and says publicly, oh, Lars, go on. I know you can make a pleasant film with a happy ending. Why don't you do that the next time? That's the Minister of Culture. And she says it, oh, that's just my opinion as a private person. But the thing is, she's not a private person. She's the Minister of Culture. So I don't think Lars von Trier cares at all what she thinks. He will get his films funded anyway. But there will be people, new filmmakers, thinking, oh, okay, so we should self-censor a bit. And I'm afraid that will get worse. At the same time, they haven't, like you say, they haven't succeeded in creating any kind of art that is like homogeneous in that sense. And yeah.
Thank you. And now I invite questions from the audience, and if I can get help with the microphone. Yes, please, back there in white. Thank you.
I should just preface my questions by saying that I've spent 6 years dealing with the Nordic region, and I hope I have developed a deep interest in, I don't know whether I've developed any knowledge, but I have certainly developed a very deep interest on what I've come to see as the Nordic differences. I won't be talking just from the global shift perspective, so I hope you'll forgive me, but my questions are that if we look at the global challenges, and I identify 3, one is environment, one is women's status, and the third you've talked about, the rise of the extreme right. And there I cite the example of the country where I was posted, where the two major parties have point blank refused the support of the extreme right party to form a government. It's impossible in India. In India, the horses would have been traded till they would have become donkeys. And you would have had a party, I mean, they would have raced to form a coalition. So these three things, which are global challenges, women's status, environment, and what I would say, the popular rejection which still continues of the extreme right. I mean, I never had any friend or anybody I talked to who said that they supported this. Of course, there must have been people who increased the number of support from 6% to 24% for the Sweden Democrats. But they are still marginalized. So how do the Nordics get things right in these three global challenges?
So women's rights, environment, and the rise of right-wing populism. So I think on women's rights, we're doing pretty well. I mean, there are still challenges, obviously, especially in business life, I would say, and in terms of there's a pay gap, but we are, I think, have been moving in the right direction. We have 50% men and women in parliament, and very strong labor market legislation and so forth. So I think we're on the right path. And how? How we will become even better is that how you can reach where we have reached. I think the answer to that is really, the women's rights in Scandinavia really originated in women's movements, and then those political ideas were picked up by the bigger parties, primarily by social democratic parties, but not until they were pressured by the women's movement. So it has to start from women themselves. I mean, it's just a fact, I think.
And I think so with, yes, and I think so with any movement. I think that the only climate legislation that is happening right now is actually happening because so many people are demonstrating, so many people are saying, signing petitions, doing things, because a lot of politics, either whether you're right wing or left wing or straight down the middle, is now driven very much by populism. It's driven very much with that the parties kind of swerve a little bit to this way and that, oh, so you're interested in climate? Oh, there's 500,000 people demonstrating for this. Oh, we better, because we want to keep our votes. So I think that NGOs in any field has much more power than they think they do. And just, keep being NGOs.
Martin, do you want to add something?
We have a panel tomorrow also about women's rights in Scandinavia that I hope that everyone here can attend. What time is it?
It's in the afternoon, tomorrow afternoon, 3:30, I think.
Yeah, 3:30 tomorrow. Yeah.
And on the question of the right-wing populism, I think the answer is this. And it was in Sweden. It was very, very close. It wasn't. It has been as you just described, but the Norwegian Populist Party is in government. It was really, really close in Sweden that we had a government with support of the Sweden Democrats, and in Denmark, who knows what will have to happen after the election. So it's really at the tipping point, I would say, in Scandinavia. And the only reason for in Sweden was that there was high pressure, really strong opposition, vocal opposition from people in the liberal parties and the Social Democratic Party. No, just the tip. It was really, really close.
I think if I could just add one thing on the far right, I think, this might sound self-serving and smug, but I think one difference between America and the Nordic countries is that the media is still doing a pretty good job in the Nordic countries. There is public service media that is, more or less independent and doing very serious journalism. There are newspapers, there are, outlets that are informing the public in a way that I think made it harder to share populist lies and exaggerations. I think America, the 2016 election was not a proud moment for the media.
Sorry, I need to interject because it's becoming a two-way dialogue here. My question might seem a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's not. Nordic Noir, it's a literature festival. Is there any connection between that and the rise of nativist sentiments? Do they go hand in hand? Because in the last few years, we've seen a lot more stuff coming out, crime fiction, bleak urban settings, the dark side of the northern part of Europe. Is that some kind of response to a certain undercurrent of what's happening at the social level and manifested in sudden burst of Nordic Noir literature?
Does anyone want to pick up on that?
Yeah. I think you are the right people to answer this, but I'll just throw in that I think a lot of Nordic crime novels are fiction, right? And they don't actually reflect a rise in violent crime. There has been a drop in violent crime in Sweden. I don't know about the other countries. And Stig Larsson, one of the most internationally successful authors, was a very far left radical, devoted his life to women's rights and anti-racism, and I don't think any of his novels really reflect any concerns that he shares would share with the far right.
I think also this Nordic noir really comes from, there are like deep roots in this tradition coming from, we had a similar kind of genre criticizing the welfare state, and the welfare state is rotten in the 70s, and it's all social democratic homogeneous hell basically, and now, so there's always been this self-hating kind of wish to paint the darker side of success. I guess that's what artists do. So,
and I just want to say on Stig Larsson is like, on the other hand, he was left-wing, and all the bad characters in his books are very rich capitalist people. Yeah. All the bad characters.
Often with Nazi histories.
But with Nazi history, yeah.
I think it's in a way sort of comparable to horror movies from affluent white suburbia in the US, right? Yeah. Which, I mean, America has a lot of violent crime, but it's not usually happening in affluent white suburbs. But that's exactly why they are such a potent environment for a chainsaw massacre, right?
Yeah. Yes. That's the microphone. Where's the microphone? Here's a question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. As a Jew and a Cohen, you're very welcome to the title and the mantle of Swede. Thank you. I can relax. The issue I would like to raise is, as being a bit of an agent provocateur, I actually don't think, I looked after elderly, I've been involved in healthcare, etc., etc. The Swedish model is a fantastic one, the Nordic model, etc. I don't think that's sustainable. I would like to hear from the panel why they think it is sustainable and possibly how it can be sustained. Thank you.
The welfare model or the healthcare? Sorry.
Generally, healthcare is a fundamental, but you're talking not only healthcare, but you're talking about human rights for healthcare and other freedoms. So in that context, I would like to ask how you think you can sustain this broader humanitarian context within the current pressures of right-wing issues, misinformation, etc. How would you try and counteract that negative perspective and change perspectives, change human behavior, or change human perceptions of where you want to be in the future to sustain your egalitarian values? Thank you.
As I said in the beginning, I actually don't think it's a stable. I think they're still strong, but they are much weaker now than they were 20 years ago. I don't think it's a stable. I think it's something that really has to be worked at. I mean, how can you work at it as a private person? You can work at it how you vote, obviously, and how you demonstrate, and what petitions you sign. But you can also work at it, for example, by choosing the local school instead of sending your child to a private school. You can do these things that constantly support the welfare system instead of saying, instead of going to a private hospital, you can say, okay, I'm part of this system. Obviously, if you had a heart condition and there's a waiting list saying you can get a bypass in 6 months, I completely understand why you would want to go to the private hospital. But the thing is that I think that, like right now, there's been all these cuts in Denmark, and I don't know if you've heard about it, but there's been this huge scandal in northern European banks, Denmark, Britain, Germany especially, where these brokers they've used a loophole in the laws to drain money out of the tax systems. And in Denmark, again, Denmark's not that big, it's 42 billion kroners that they've drained out of the system over a year, mainly one guy. And the reason it's happened is, and this is horrible, there's this one guy in the tax system, tax worker, he was the one he was at work, he was tired, he was, oh, it looks right, yeah. So he's been painted as a bad guy, but the reason, there was no one else to check him. And I don't think that a crisis like that is a good thing because it takes away from the Danish welfare system. But the good thing is that now it is so obvious that something is broken in the welfare system, so people will vote otherwise, I hope. Obviously, that would be lovely.
I would like to hear the other people's, the panelists on that basis, please.
So I can say a few words and then I'll give the last word to you, Martin, and then we need to end this. So I think, on the upside, just to your point, I think what speaks for the model is that there's really high support for the general welfare system still in the Scandinavian countries. So that's a big thing. And there's a high level of trust still. And this system really builds on trust because you need to pay and trust that the system will give you back what you need, but also that it doesn't benefit other people or that it's entirely corrupt. So I think that's really good. But I think what you need to show is that it's high. If it's not high quality, this whole thing falls apart. And the specific thing that Henriette has been talking about is the slow decline. That is really the threat to the system. So what you need is a really high ambitions in terms of quality. If you keep the quality, I think you will keep people's trust and also the support for this general idea. So that's my answer. And Martin, you have 9 seconds.
Should we do a last question or?
No.
Okay.
Just if you want to. No. Okay. One last question. I'm allowed one last question. Yes, the gentleman over here.
So I live in India now, but I've recently shifted from the US. I'm curious to hear you speak on, and I know this has been critiqued, but in my own experience in the community that I lived in the US, it's true. This notion that a lot of the support for the America First and Donald Trump actually comes from a segment of the population who their policies that they're enacting hurts. So, for example, the coal industry, which is often evoked by Trump and bringing coal back, has continued to decline and wages have continued to get worse during his time in office. So you have a group of people supporting a political system that actually further disenfranchises them financially or is not acting in their own best interest in reality. So whatever need is being met is something other than the narrative this is the left behind old white working class that, you know, we're not being supported economically. So do you see that same phenomenon in what's happening in the Nordic countries? Or is this actually, is the right actually addressing a real need of this group, or is it, you know, analogous to the US?
I think that's a really good question, and I mean, it's this two-dimensional politics that we have now. It used to be the left versus the right, and you would have the fight over the size of the state, basically, the size of taxes. But now you have this other axis, which are these cultural identity issues, right? And I think, I mean, the challenge for progressives or for social democratic idea is, if you have the conflict on the left and right, then there is big support for the welfare state. But if there's a conflict always on identity or these made-up things, then it's really hard to build a coalition on economic policies that benefits the people you're talking about. So the challenge is really to break that narrative, and that's a really long discussion, so we won't have it now. So thank you so much to my panelists and to this great audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Henriette Rostrup, Martin Gelin, and Karin Pettersson. This session was sponsored by Nordic Lights. Can we please give them a very big round of applause? Coming up next at the Bar Hall at 4:15